Okay, first of all, welcome back everyone to our Monday night Parsha webcast. It's been a few weeks now because of the Holy Yom Tovim. The last time I believe I gave this class was between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Fortunately, after that I had my surgery, so you can still see my eye is shut, the right eye. So I apologize for that, but it's nice to be back, and being that this past Shabbos, right after Simchas Torah, was the Shabbos Bereshis, so we find ourselves already in, in the portion of Noach. So this week is the second portion, so we'll focus in on the portion of Noach. The Parsha of Noach begins with it's the story of Noach is basically two stories. One, the main one, is the story of the flood, that the portion tells us that God saw that the deeds of man became exceedingly corrupt, and they engaged in all kinds of terrible behavior, immoral, and he basically said, I regret that I have created mankind and even the animals. He decided to do away with everything, to destroy it, and he told Noach to build the ark and to go into the ark with his family, which was numbered 8 people, and he told him to take in of every species, a male and female, of the non-kosher species, of the kosher species he told him to take in 7, so that when he exits he can bring sacrifices from it. But the idea was to perpetuate all of the species so that after the flood they can recreate, procreate, and start the world again. And the rains fell for 40 days and 40 nights, all the underground reservoirs all bursted forth, and the world was engulfed in a flood, a deluge, for a year. Basically, it was a whole year that the world was underwater. And everyone died, all animals, all mankind, everything. And after the end of the year when the year was up, God told Noach to go out of the ark and to repopulate and to start again. And he did so. And he built the world anew. At the end of the portion there's another story there's 2 stories actually, one with the children of Noach and what the middle son of his did to him. He violated him. What happened was Noach, after he came out of the ark, he planted a vineyard and he had to drink, and he became intoxicated, and he lay naked in his tent, and his son went in and did what he of course shouldn't have done, and he violated him, and he cursed him. And the Torah goes through all the different nations that came from Noach, 70 nations to be exact. And at the very end, the Torah tells us about one more story about the Tower of Babel. That after the flood, sometime after, the people, once it was populated again, so we're talking a couple of hundred years later, a few hundred years later, they decided to all unite in a project to build a tower that would go up into heaven somehow, and that they would, as Rashi tells us, based on the Midrash, that their intention was to fight and go to war against God. And God, of course, came down and confused them and mixed them up and dispersed them around the world, confused their languages, and that's when all the languages came into being. Till then, everyone spoke the language of the Torah, which is the Hebrew tongue, the holy tongue, but after that, that's when they started with all the different languages, because God made them all forget the unified language. And they had to create new languages. There was no more unity, and everyone dispersed, and the 70 nations came to be. And at the very end, the Torah tells us about the progeny of the descendants of Noach, the 10 generations that came from Noach till Abraham, And the end of the portion tells us about the birth of Abraham, and that closes the portion. So the main story, as you all know, is the story of the flood. So I want to talk about the flood today and give you perhaps a new perspective on what happened over there. Because what we see from the flood is an interesting thing. We see a little paradox. On the one hand, the world got stronger. Because what happened after the flood? Once Noach exited the ark, God made a promise, a covenant with him, with Noach, that he would never ever destroy the world again like this. He made a promise, a covenant, a bris. And he said that the world will forever continue to exist, day and night, all the seasons, because in the time of the flood, everything came to a halt. There were no seasons. The planets were all out of whack. The sun didn't shine, the moon didn't work, nothing worked. It was a total chaos. And after the flood, God made a promise to Noah that such a thing will never ever happen again, and that the world will always continue to exist. It's as if a new force, a new energy entered into the world that gave strength to the world, that on its own it can never destroy itself. It will always be here. So on the one hand, it becomes stronger. Because before the flood, the world was not that, didn't have that strength. In fact, when the world degenerated into terrible behavior, God, even though God was very impressed with the world that he created, in Genesis we read that he was very happy, he saw that the world was wonderful and great, exceedingly good. So he was very happy with the way he created the world, but it did not have the internal strength to survive a time when the people would descend into complete immoral behavior. And in fact, the world did come to an end. Post-flood, the world is promised that that will never happen. So from that perspective, the world got stronger. Right? It has some kind of internal eternity to it. That this can never happen again. And it never did, and never will. On the other hand, we see clearly that the world got weaker. Where do we see that it got weaker? People know, before the flood, people were living into almost a millennium. The first generations lived till up to 950 years, 960 years, 969 even, the oldest. So we're talking about incredibly long lives. Post-flood, that came to an end. I mean, the lifespan of people and everything else was drastically shortened. So there we see a weakening in the world. Correct?
Appears to be.
It appears to be that way. So what is it? Did the world get stronger or did it get weaker?
What?
So I want to share with you an insight that the Rabbi shared with all of us. It's a printed sikha, it's a printed essay, in which the Rabbi discusses what was the real effect of the flood. But as an introduction, he says as follows. Goes back to creation. What was the creation of the world for? What was the purpose of creation? The purpose of creation was for the Torah. You remember it says, in every day of the creation it says that Vayihi Erev, Vayihi Boker, Yom Rishon, Yom Shein Echad, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi. It was night and it was evening and it was morning, one day, a second day, a third day. By the sixth day it says Yom Hashishi. Right? That's how our Kiddush begins, Yom Hashishi. It doesn't say Yom Shishi. It doesn't say a sixth day, it says the sixth day. Why the change? By all the other 5 days, Sunday, Monday through Thursday, it says Sheni, Shlishi. It doesn't say Ha-Sheni, Ha-Shlishi. It doesn't have that Hey. And Rashi tells us the reason is because when God created the world, and it came to the end of the 6th day and the world was finished, he said that God was evening and night, the 6th day. Why the? Because the world, God made a condition with the world that it will sustain and continue to exist only on condition that on the famous 6th day, Hashishi, that famous 6th day, which is the 6th day of Sivan, when God gave the Torah, the Jewish people will say yes, that they will receive the Torah. So in other words, the whole creation of the world and the whole existence of the world is dependent on the Torah. It's for the receiving of the Torah. It's for Torah. What is the purpose of Torah? What happened when God gave the Torah? We know the Medrash tells us that when God gave the Torah, He wanted. I'm sorry. The purpose was that the Jewish people should connect the upper realms, the spiritual realms, with the lower realms, with our realm, to make a merge between the two. Do you understand that? We spoke about this many times, but let me briefly explain. The spiritual realm, which is God's realm, so to say, is entirely spiritual, godly, infinite. Our world is physical, mundane, corporeal. And in the beginning of creation, God separated these two realms completely. Separated these two realms. The realm of heaven was the realm of heaven, and the realm of earth was the realm of earth, and there will be no merging, no ability to bring heaven down to earth. But the purpose was that when the Torah is given, that would change. In other words, that the purpose of Torah was that the Jewish people should be able to bring heaven down to earth, to sanctify the physical by doing mitzvot, by bringing God into everything they do, everything they engage in, their food, their drink, their sleep time, their vacation time, everything becomes a sanctified experience. So the purpose was to take the upper realm, the higher realm, and take the lower realm and bring them together. But before the Torah was given, these two realms were completely separate. Meaning, in order for Jews to bring heaven and earth together, the higher and the lower, you need a higher and you need a lower, right? If you want, the purpose is to make this and this come together. So first you need this and then you need this. Then you can bring them together. So in the creation of the world, up till Matan Torah, God created, there was an upper realm and there was a lower realm. They were separate, but these two realms existed. Before the flood, to be more specific, before the flood, what was emphasized in the world was the fact that it's being sustained by the upper realm, by God. After the flood, the lower realm, the world, which is the lower realm, and we'll explain this in a moment, the lower realm was given the ability not to merge with heaven, but the lower realm reached a new level of purity. Let me explain. This will be understood by bringing in another subject of this week's portion. That is the rainbow. You know about the rainbow? It's in this week's portion. God tells Noach after the flood, I promise never to flood again the world and destroy it again. And he made with him a sign. What's the sign that I will never do this again? The rainbow.
Now that means that he wants to do it, but he's not doing it and shows the rainbow?
Right. In a way, that's true.
wants.
It could be, yeah. Why, when people get excited, oh, there's a rainbow. It's not
It's
so
not
exciting.
good,
you know?
yeah. When you think about it.
That's stopping God from doing what he promised not to do. In other words, before the flood, this would mean, another 40 days of rain and a flood and an ark, if you're lucky. You're right. But it's much more than that. Here's the question about the rainbow. This would seem that the rainbow phenomenon did not exist before the flood. Could that be? The rainbow is a natural phenomenon. What is a rainbow? When the sun rays meet with the clouds and and they shine in such a way that it creates the rainbow colors. This is not was not a sign. This is a phenomenon that exists in the spirit, in the physical world. It's a natural thing. What does it mean that it didn't exist before the flood? That's what the Torah is telling us, that this is a new phenomenon that he made as a sign that there will not be a flood. That means that for the first 1650, whatever those, some 1600 years, there was no rainbow. Indeed, that's the truth. What is a rainbow? Let's discuss it. What did we just say? The rainbow is when the clouds, what's the cloud? A cloud is the mist that comes up from the water, from the earth,
From the heating of the sun.
and forms clouds, right?
Yeah.
The sun shines on those clouds and creates the rainbow phenomenon. Before the flood, and here's the key, before the flood, the earth, our physical world, was very, very coarse. Spiritually, it did not have the ability for refinement at all. And it manifested itself in the very physical parameters and physical properties of our world. Let's take the rainbow, for example, as an example. As I said, the rainbow is a cloud and the sun meeting. What is a cloud? The mist that comes up from the earth. If there's a thick cloud, are you going to see a rainbow?
No.
A very thick cloud, will you see a rainbow? No. When do you see a rainbow? When the cloud is a little bit thinner, more refined, less dense, and so on and so forth. Before the world was created, before the flood happened, the whole physical world was in a state of impurity. What does impurity mean? It could not be purified. It could not become spiritually couldn't develop itself as a spiritual entity at all. I'm going to give you an example of this in a minute. Post-flood, what happened? The flood washed the world. You said it before, the world went through a mikveh. 40 days, the mikveh has 40 measures of water. The world went through a massive mikveh experience, where the whole world became purified on a whole new level. What does that mean? That the world now on its own has the ability for refinement. And where did you see this manifest itself? In the phenomenon of a rainbow. The clouds before the flood were never thin. They were dense, thick, coarse, representing the spiritual reality of the physical world at that time. The inability for it to be refined, to be elevated, so that the sun rays should shine through it, couldn't happen. Sun rays represent godliness. The Pasuk says, Ki shemesh u'magen Hashem Elokim. The sun is referred to as the name of God. The sunshine is the physical manifestation of a spiritual shine. So God shined before the world was created, before the flood, but it could not penetrate the physical. Couldn't. The physical is not able to be elevated and refined at all. But the flood accomplished that the waters washed it out, meaning purified it, so that the world reached a whole new level of ability. Let me give you the example I wanted to give you. You take a teacher and students. You could take a brilliant teacher who can go into a classroom with lazy students, or not lazy, who have no ability for intellectual, for their own intellectual stimulation. They can't develop any intellectual idea on their own. But this teacher is so great, so brilliant, that he has the ability, the oratory skills, and the brilliance to mesmerize these students and teach them the loftiest levels loftiest concepts of some scientific whatever, some wisdom. He can go there and shine such a strong light of intellect. He's brilliant, that they will be moved. But take him out of the picture, they're completely clueless. They can't do it on their own. Their brains are not capable, and there's some people like that. I mean, they just don't have the ability to develop ideas on their own. They can never figure it out on their own. But getting a teacher second to none, he'll teach it to them. But then you have students that the teacher doesn't do that. He gives them basic skills, basic information, says, now I'm giving you homework. Go do it on your own. The students do it on their own. They work it out because they have the ability. So it's two different students. One student understands it on the wonderful level, the teacher's level, because the teacher is shining on them. On their own, they're incapable. The second set of students, he's not shining the light. He's giving them basic information. He's telling them, I'm giving you these assignments to work out on your own. And they, through effort, work it out on their own. And they write up an essay, explain the concept, and they present it to their teacher. Now, of course, the students it'll never reach the level, they'll never be able to explain it like the teacher could. They didn't hear the explanation from the teacher. They worked this out on their own. So it's on a much lower level, but it's their own. The world is exactly in the same way. The world has these two phases. When God created the world, in the 6 days of creation, the Torah tells us that God saw that it was wonderful. It says that the world is created perfect. What does that mean? How perfect was it if the world came to an end 1,500 years later? Was it perfect? You know what the meaning of perfect is? It was perfect because God, the upper realm, shined, created it. It was all His doing. He created. He's a master creator, no question about it. A creator like God is going to master a tremendous piece of work. It was great on God's terms. He produced a masterpiece of a creation. But how about creation on its own? What's the potential for the created reality, the created existence? Could it become beautiful on its own terms? Could it become refined without God shining on it?
Evidently not.
Evidently not. So it's true that the world was on a high, very, very wonderful state at the end of the sixth day, at the end of Friday, some 5,774 years ago, when God created the world. Sure, God produced a masterpiece. It shined, it was great, because God's light was shining on it. It wasn't its own light. It had no connection. It had no inherent ability to shine on its own light. It had no light of its own. That was the world till the flood came. Therefore, how long is God going to produce the godly energy to sustain a world like this? As long as He's interested in it. What's going to make Him interested? If world of creation is a decent place to be. But a creation continues to distance itself from God's will, and the original plan is gone, meaning they're corrupt, they're degenerated into terrible behavior. He's not interested anymore. So the world comes to an end. 1 second. The world comes to an end. So the world was strong before creation. Only on God's terms. Nothing of its own. Very little on its own. That's why it could come to an end. And it did. Now let's talk about creation after, and about the world after the flood. Post-flood, the flood did something to the world. It gave it an inherent ability for refinement. It put it through
It cleansed itself?
It cleansed it. It gave the world a new strength, that it has the ability on its own, like the student in the second classroom. It can produce light on its own. It can work it out. It can be refined. The clouds suddenly are not so dense anymore on their own. It's coming from the earth. Well, every cloud comes from the earth. The earth produces the cloud. But suddenly the earth is producing a refined cloud where this light of the sun, meaning the light of God, can shine through. And it creates this wonderful, magnificent, rainbow. That's a reflection of a reality that happened in the world post-flood. And it manifested itself in the very physical nature of the world. Because the world was elevated a notch, more than a notch. The world elevated itself to the point where it could be refined. When will it be refined? When did we start the work of refinement for real? Of course, when the God gave the Torah. And even a little bit before, when Avram came. Avram came and began the refinement process. But it's gotten a whole new level when the Torah was given.
One question.
Yeah.
Now, if there was no commandments or rules or behave rules before Noah,
Yeah.
how do the people know how to behave?
There were rules. God gave rules to Noach, to Avram, to Adam.
Not before Noah.
To Adam. Yeah, they weren't allowed to kill. Everyone knew that. They were told to cleave to their wife and procreate. They knew that they weren't allowed to cleave to other people's wives. I mean, these basic rules were given. It's not like they didn't have any rules and regulations. Basic rules for living, for normal societal, advancement were given. Were there. So yeah, the world already from days of from Adam, where God gave certain rules, not a Torah. He didn't give a Torah yet, obviously, but certain rules He gave.
I mean, his first rule was not to eat from the tree.
Okay, that was only for a few hours. That's
Right.
not an everlasting rule. He's talking about the rules of mankind.
Right.
That was only for Adam and Chava, but there were certain rules. So what happened after the flood? God makes a promise to Noach, never again. How could He make such a promise again? How could He make such a promise? The promise is that it's more than, even though the world is going to, even if it happens where the world is so terrible, and I want to destroy the world, I'm not going to, because I'm going to remember because I'm going to remember my promise by the sign of the rainbow. It's much more than that. What God is telling Noach is, the world will never degenerate like that. Or if the world does degenerate like that, it has the ability on its own for tshuva, for correction. It's because the world went up to a whole new level. So before the flood was created, what was the emphasis? The Elyonim, the upper realm. It was God's doing everything. Why was the world perfect? Because God made it perfect. God created a perfect world. The world on its own had no ability for refinement. Post-flood came the second. Now and remember what I said. In order for the Torah, what's the purpose of Torah? That the upper realms and the lower realms should be able to come together. So He needs an upper realm and He needs a lower realm. The upper realm was the world before the flood. The lower realms were the world post-flood, where the lower realms developed an internal, inherent ability for refinement. And that was manifested in the reality of the ability for a rainbow. And the rainbow is not so, it's more about the clouds than about the sun. Because the sun didn't change. What changed was the clouds. Which reflects the idea that the world was now elevated to a whole new level. Now we also understand why we have this paradox post-flood. On the one hand, they got stronger. On the one hand, they got weaker. What I said before, that it got stronger, that the world can no longer be destroyed. There's some kind of, its connection to the godly creative force is on a whole new level. It can never really be detached again from it. So it's connected to God's unchanging, right? God is unchanging, and so is the world suddenly. It can never change. It will always continue to be. Then there we see a stronger connection to God. On the other hand, they got weaker. Why did they get weaker? Because where did the strength, where this new strength, what was where do we see that this new strength? In other words, the new strength that we're talking about, that the world can never be destroyed again, is not because God started shining a higher level of godliness on the world. No, it's the world suddenly, after the flood, underwent a change and elevated itself. And from our own terms. In other words, the change was from the world's perspective, from the creation's perspective, not creator's perspective. The world on its own became a world that can do tshuva, can correct itself if it ever does degenerate. But since it's not God's doing, it's the world's, so it has its limitations.
So it has like the student.
It's like the student. The student will never produce an essay like the teacher.
Right.
Or like the students in the first classroom. When you ask the students in the first classroom, write up what the teacher just told you, if they're smart, if they're good at it, they'll give you an essay like the teacher. Second to none. But it's not them. It's not them. The teacher was shining. He was brilliant. Not them. They're not brilliant. It's his brilliance that they're reflecting. In the second classroom, they're reflecting their own brilliance. Well, you're right, it's their brilliance, not the teachers. It's going to be on the students' level, which is much lower than the teachers. The world elevated itself. How much could the world elevate itself? On its terms. It's limited after all. Therefore, because it reached a level of eternity on its own terms, so mankind, the life force of mankind, was also reduced to the world's level, which is 120 years, not 900. Why did the people live so long before the flood? Because God was giving them an unlimited amount of life. It wasn't the body was a body that could live in its own terms for 1,000 years. God was a kind God. He gave them unlimited amount of energy, so they went on forever. But now the world is on its in a sense, it reached perfection, but its own level's perfection, which of course is much more limited.
But
so the reason that it's forever going to remain is the very reason why it will remain only for 120 years. Meaning that mankind's life. It's going to forever remain because the world uncovered a depth of its own. The ability for refinement. Its own ability, its own perfection. Its own perfection can produce life forever and ever, but each life is going to be limited, much more than before. Because we were sucking off God's life force. And today we're also, no one can live on their own, but it's a world that is more emphasized the lower realm. The lower realm is what's emphasized.
Rabbi,
here we see an interesting thing.
Is that a bad thing?
Not at all. It's a good thing. The flood, post-flood's much better.
Yeah.
You know where we see this interesting? By Avram. Avram began the Torah period, right? Even though he was before the Torah was given, but with him began the 2,000 years of Torah. Right. The world has 6,000 years. The first 1,000 years is Tohu, chaos, which came to an end with the flood. Second 2,000 years is 2,000 years of Torah, when Avram came and began the process of the Jewish people to receive the Torah. And the last 2,000 years are 2,000 years of, I think, Geula, the potential for redemption, if I'm not mistaken. So when does the 2,000 years of Torah begin? The era of Torah begins with Avram. Here we see an interesting thing, but Avram, we see the synthesis of both. Avram had Yitzchak, right? At what age?
Very right.
100.
At 100 years old. Sarah was how old? 90 years old. In other words, they were a throwback to before the flood.
And they lived.
Before the flood, people were having children in their hundreds. When 150, they had kids. When no one was having kids when they were 20. Well, you look in the Torah. When he was 180, he had a kid. That's what it says, right? Because why not? If you can live till 900, it's like our life. The first 20 years, so 20% of your life you're single. Hopefully more than 25% of your life. So there also 25% they were single. They didn't have kids. So they were having from 100 and on. We see by Avram that same idea. Avram had a child when he was 100 years old. On the other hand, how long did they live? The short lives. They didn't have the long periods of life. He was a synthesis of both. He took the two because he started the Purpose of Torah to connect the higher realm with the lower realm. In other words, after the flood, what was the world state of existence? An eternity, but on the lower realms terms, right? That's why it produced life that is much more limited and much shorter. Avram, and the purpose of post-Matan Torah is to take the higher realm and inject it into the lower realm. To take the higher realm, right? To connect these two, to take the higher realm and inject it into the lower realm. What does that mean? That our lower realm should have the ability to reflect not its own purity, but an infinite purity, an infinite level of purity, and that's Torah mitzvahs. When a Yid takes a pair of tefillin, a piece of leather, and turns it into tefillin, he's not uncovering the world's limited refinement ability. He's injecting the Eir Ein Sof, the infinite light of God, into this physical realm. He's connecting these two realms in a real way. Avram started that. Where do we see it? By having Yitzchak at 100 years old, and Sarah by 90. He took both periods and combined them together. He started it, and when God came down to Mount Sinai at that famous day, on the 6th of Sivan, in the year 2448, He gave the world a whole new ability. Not that the world should be able to elevate itself and be refined on the world's limited reality, world's, own terms and level. But now we have the ability to inject the Eir Ein Sof, the Creator's life or light, into our realm. And that's every mitzvah that we do. We take the physical, that has the potential for refinement, but we don't refine it as they refined the world in the post-flood till Avram. They're refining it with the original light, the light of the sun, which is penetrating, meaning the light of God, which penetrates, and you have these two realms really coming together, the infinite and the finite coming together. So before the flood, it was the realm of the infinite. It was on the infinite's terms. That's why the world on its own, as it separated itself from the infinite light of Hashem, it started sinning and doing terrible things. It had no life of its own. It had no eternity of its own. Post-flood, it suddenly went through a mikveh, this incredible experience, that the world on its own suddenly developed its ability for perfection, but on its own terms. So that's the lower realms, right? The lower realms' ability came to the fore, was revealed. Matan Torah brought those two together. Now you can take that lower realm and inject it with the higher realm. That's a whole new experience. So this is a process. Bereshis is the higher realm, Noach is the lower realm, and Lech Lecha, starting with Avram, combines them together.
Wow. And that's why we say the Torah is God.
The Torah is God, exactly. Thank you very, very much.
Very interesting.
We'll see you next week for
Wonderful 5 minutes.
Parsha Lech Lecha.